In 1824, a German nun who had never left her convent described a stone house on a mountain in Turkey. She described the layout, the terrace, the two windows, the precise orientation on the slope. She was bedridden with stigmatic wounds. She had never traveled more than a few kilometers from the village where she was born. She had no maps of Turkey. She had never been to Asia Minor. And between 1819 and 1824, in dictated sessions recorded by the German writer Clemens Brentano, she described a specific mountain east of a specific ancient city, and on that mountain, a specific small stone house where the mother of Jesus had spent her final years. She died in 1824. 67 years passed. Then, on July 29, 1891, two Lazarist missionaries based in Smyrna, Father Eugene Pula and Father Jung, took Emmerich's descriptions and used them as a map. They found it. My name is Nathan, former history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. I'm sitting here with two documents open in front of me. The first is an 1852 printing of Clemens Brentano's compilation of Anne Catherine Emmerich's visions, The Life of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's not a recent book. It smells like a church basement. The second is Father Poulin's expedition report from 1891. I have been reading them side by side for the better part of an evening, and here is what I keep returning to. Emmerich described a mountain east of ancient Ephesus near the sea. She described the terrace, the stone construction, the two windows, the direction the entrance faced, the path up the slope. She said it was not a large house. She said Mary had lived there with John. When Poulin and Jung reached Mount Koressos 9 kilometers south of Ephesus, they found ruins, stone foundations, the terrace, the two windows, oriented as she had described. Archaeological work on the foundations dated them to the 1st century. The upper walls showed a later reconstruction, 6th or 7th century. But the base, the original base, is 1st century stonework. Now, I want to be precise about what I can and cannot say here because the English-speaking audience deserves precision. There is a complication. Scholars who examined Brentano's original manuscripts found that he had access to apocryphal texts, travelers' accounts, and geographical references about Asia Minor. It is possible that some of the specific geographical details, the mountain east of Ephesus, the distance from the sea, came from Brentano's research rather than Emmerich's visions alone. That possibility exists. I cannot dismiss it. But here is what cannot be explained by that possibility. If Brentano assembled the description from existing sources, those sources existed. The tradition existed. The memory that Mary had lived near Ephesus existed in written material prior to 1891. And that makes the question unavoidable in either case. Why did the tradition survive at all? What put it there? René Laurentin, considered by many the most important Mariologist of the 20th century, Peritus at Vatican II, spent decades on Marian historical questions, spent years examining both Emmerich's visions and the Ephesus tradition. He treated this as a serious historical question, not a mystical curiosity, a serious historical question with a serious documentary record behind it. That is where I want to start. There are two traditions about where Mary died. The first is Jerusalem. Acts 1:14 places Mary with the disciples after the Ascension in Jerusalem. The early Jerusalem community is the natural setting. The Dormition Abbey on Mount Zion marks the traditional site of her death and Assumption. It is the dominant Western tradition, promoted consistently by the Church for centuries. It is the site on most pilgrimage maps. It is the image in most altarpieces. When you picture the end of Mary's story, you almost certainly picture Jerusalem. The second tradition is Ephesus, and it is older than you think. The first written reference to the tradition that Mary had lived in Ephesus does not come from a medieval mystic or a 19th century nun's vision. It comes from the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD. In the synodal letter produced by the council, the foundational document of one of the most important gatherings in the history of Christianity, the tradition that Mary had lived in Ephesus is referenced. The council itself was held in Ephesus. Emperor Theodosius II convened it there. It was the council that condemned Nestorius and declared Mary Theotokos, Mother of God, the Church's most important doctrinal statement about Mary's identity. And the earliest surviving written reference to the Ephesus tradition was written in the same city where that declaration was made. The Church made its most important declaration about Mary in the city where she may have spent her final years in a document that mentioned she had been there, and then for 16 centuries said almost nothing official about it. You always assumed Jerusalem. You saw it in every painting, every altarpiece, every Easter window in every church you have ever sat in. The golden light over the Dormition Abbey. The disciples gathered around her in a room that looked like the upper room. Of course she died where Jesus died. Of course the story ended where it began. Jerusalem was the center. Jerusalem was the capital. Jerusalem was where the story was. You never questioned it. Why would you? The Church never contradicted it. And that is the sentence that stops me now. The Church never contradicted it. But the Church also never confirmed it. Not officially. Not with the doctrinal precision it applies to things it actually wants to settle. You were given the Jerusalem picture without a footnote, without a "we believe but the historical record is incomplete," without any of the careful hedging the institution deploys when it wants to manage uncertainty. Just the painting, just the altarpiece, just the assumption that the story ended where it began. And the assumption was never your fault. It was placed there. Let me take you to the textual anchor because this is where the investigation gets specific. John 19:26 and 27. Jesus is on the cross. He looks down and sees his mother standing there, and beside her the beloved disciple. And Jesus says to the beloved disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. 4 words, his own home. Now, where was the beloved disciple's home? This is not a contested question in scholarship. John's documented ministry base was Ephesus. The Basilica of St. John at Ephesus, built by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, marks his burial site. His ministry there is referenced in Revelation, in the letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, in the early church historians who describe the Johannine community at Ephesus. This is not disputable. John was in Ephesus. His community was in Ephesus. His tomb is in Ephesus. If you follow the beloved disciples' documented trajectory from the foot of the cross, you end up in Ephesus. If Jesus entrusted Mary to the one disciple whose home base was Ephesus, then from that hour he took her into his own home, leads you where the archaeological record, the council letter, the 1st century foundations on Mount Keresos, and Anne Catherine Emmerich's description all point to a small stone house on a mountain in Turkey, 9 kilometers south of ancient Ephesus. The mathematics is not complicated. The only thing missing is the sentence the Church has refused to say for 16 centuries. Now I need to tell you about what the popes did, because this is where the investigation moves from textual analysis to institutional behavior. And institutional behavior, in my experience, is the most honest kind of evidence there is. In 1896, Pope Leo XIII made a canonical decision about the sacred sites associated with Mary's death and Assumption. He removed the plenary indulgences from Jerusalem's Dormition site, and he redirected them to Ephesus. Let me make sure you understand what plenary indulgences are in the structure of Catholic theology. They are not decorative. They are not symbolic. In the official teaching of the Church, a plenary indulgence remits all temporal punishment due to sin. For a believing Catholic, this is the most powerful spiritual benefit the institutional Church can confer. It is the Church's most significant official spiritual reward, and in 1896, Leo the Thieves took that reward away from Jerusalem and gave it to a stone house in Turkey. No announcement, no press release, no doctrinal explanation, just the canonical act. Then in 1961, Pope John XXIII granted perpetual plenary indulgences to pilgrims who visited the Ephesus house. Perpetual, not for a jubilee year, not for a special occasion, perpetual. Then in 1967, Pope Paul VI became the first pope to visit the site. He gifted a bronze lamp. Then Pope John Paul II visited. He celebrated an outdoor mass there for thousands of pilgrims. And standing at the house, he addressed Mary directly. Not as a theological proposition, not as a figure being commemorated at a historically uncertain location. He said, and I want you to hear exactly what he chose to say. You who live here, not you who may have lived here, not you to whom this place is dedicated, not you in whose memory we gather, you who live here, a sitting pope, in the most carefully managed institution in human history, where papal words are drafted and reviewed and considered for their canonical and diplomatic implications. That was what he chose to say. Then in 2006, Pope Benedict XVI celebrated Mass at the house, 5 popes, and not one of them, not Leo III, not John XXIII, not Paul VI, not John Paul II, not Benedict XVI, issued an official declaration confirming the authenticity of the site. 5 popes visited. 5 canonical acts were performed. 0 formal declarations. There is a specific posture that institutions adopt when they know something they cannot officially say. It is not silence. It is this. It is plenary indulgences redirected without explanation. It is perpetual designations. It is 5 papal visits with bronze lamps and outdoor masses and carefully chosen words. It is doing everything the institution does when it wants to consecrate something as sacred, and then stopping just short of the sentence that would require dismantling what is officially on the other side of the argument. That is not ignorance. That is management. And management of that precision, sustained across 110 years, from Leo III in 1896 to Benedict XVI in 2006, tells you something that no official declaration could. The institution knows what it cannot say. I want to pause here and tell you about a moment I have not told many people. I visited the site, the house on Mount Caressos. During a research trip I took while I was still trying to figure out whether this investigation was going to take me somewhere I was prepared to follow. I went in the afternoon, after the main pilgrim groups had moved through. I expected a tourist site, information placards, a gift shop, the managed experience of a church-approved holy site. What I found was something else. The room is small. The stone is old. The walls are dense with handwritten notes pressed into every available crack and corner, in 40 languages, Romanian and Spanish and Korean and Arabic and Portuguese and French and languages I could not identify. Women in hijab stood beside Carmelite nuns. A man in a business suit was crying quietly in the corner. Nobody was asking anybody to explain themselves. I stood there for a while. Then I saw a Vatican representative. I recognized him by the clerical collar and the badge he wore, standing near the entrance. I waited until he was alone. I asked him, "Does the church believe this site is authentic?" He looked at me for a moment. He said the church does not take an official position. Then he went back to praying. I stood there for a long time after that, because that sentence, the church does not take an official position, is not the same as we don't know. Institutions that don't know say we don't know. Institutions that are still investigating say we continue to examine the evidence. Institutions that are genuinely uncertain say the historical record is incomplete. The church does not take an official position is the sentence institutions use when they know something they cannot say. It is a very specific kind of answer. I have heard it before. In other archives, in other hallways, in other conversations with people wearing badges. It always means the same thing. There is a position. It is just not official. There is one more piece I need you to hold. The Council of Ephesus in 431 AD was called to settle the question of whether Mary could be called Theotokos, God-bearer, Mother of God. It was the most theologically charged gathering of its era. Nestorius was condemned. The declaration that Mary was the Mother of God became the official teaching of the unified church. The council was held in Ephesus, not in Jerusalem, not in Antioch, not in Alexandria or Constantinople or Rome. In Ephesus, the synodal letter from that council contains the earliest written reference to the tradition that Mary had lived in Ephesus. The church chose, or accepted, or was drawn to, making its foundational declaration about Mary's divine motherhood in the city where the oldest surviving written reference to her presence in that city was produced at that same council. I do not know if that was deliberate. I am not sure it matters. What matters is this: the Church's own foundational declaration about Mary as Mother of God was made in Ephesus. The tradition that placed her there was referenced in the document that made the declaration. And the Church has spent 16 centuries saying almost nothing official about either of those facts in relation to each other. The silence is shaped. It has a contour. It covers something. You are on a mountain in Turkey. The stone room is smaller than you expected. There are handwritten notes pressed into every crack in the wall, in 40 languages, paper folded and refolded until it fits into the stone. People's names, people's requests, things people need someone to hear. Beside you, a Muslim woman in a headscarf is lighting a candle. To your left, a Catholic nun in grey habit is kneeling. Between them, a space of perhaps 2 feet. Nobody is negotiating the space. Nobody is explaining themselves. Outside, through the stone wall, you can hear the Aegean wind. A brass plate beside the entrance reads, Maria Mana, Mother Mary's house, not the Basilica of the Blessed Virgin Mary, not the Church of the Assumption of Mary, not any of the official designations the Vatican employs when it formally recognizes a sacred site. Just the local Turkish name, inscribed in metal, on the door of a stone room where 5 popes have prayed. There is no official sign from Rome. There is only the brass plate and the centuries of feet that wore the path into the stone. Here is where J.J. Benítez enters, not as mysticism, but as investigative logic. Benítez spent 40 years working through the post-crucifixion period. The volumes of Caballo de Troya that deal with the weeks and months after Golgotha document in detail the atmosphere of threat that surrounded anyone closely associated with Jesus in Jerusalem. Arrests were happening. Executions were happening. James the son of Zebedee was executed by Herod Agrippa, Acts 12:2. Peter was imprisoned. The Jerusalem disciples were under sustained pressure from both the Jewish authorities and the Roman administration. In that environment, what was John supposed to do with Mary? Benítez's framework is specific. Jesus' mandate from the cross was not abstract. He identified Mary by name, identified the beloved disciple by name, and issued what Benítez treats as the most sacred obligation a dying man can impose: protection of the person most precious to him. John received that obligation in front of witnesses. John was not going to keep Mary in the city where she was most recognizable, most identifiable, most at risk. John's documented ministry base was Ephesus. He took her there. That is not mysticism. That is the only decision that follows from what Jesus asked, what the situation required, and where John's own life trajectory led. Benítez's principle applied to the geographical question. The Church promotes the Jerusalem tradition because Jerusalem is the institutional capital of Christianity. It is where the Church was born. It is the sacred geography the Church owns and administers and positions itself within. Ephesus is not. The Church has no comparable institutional investment in Ephesus. It cannot manage the Ephesus tradition the same way it manages Jerusalem. And Benítez observed, and this is the sentence I keep returning to when I think about this investigation, 40 years of investigation. 15 journeys through this ground, and the pattern is always the same. What the Church cannot control, it makes uncertain. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is an observation about how institutions behave when they encounter evidence they did not generate and cannot contain. The Jerusalem tradition is institutional. It is embedded in the Church's sacred geography, its pilgrimage economy, its doctrinal narrative. Ephesus is something else. Ephesus is 1st century foundations on a mountain in Turkey, a council letter from 431, 5 papal visits without a single declaration, and a German nun who described a stone house she had never seen. The Church can visit Ephesus. It cannot own it. And what the institution cannot own, it leaves in institutional limbo. Not denied, not confirmed, managed with plenary indulgences and bronze lamps, and the specific precision of a sentence that says we do not take an official position. Go back to John 19:27. From that hour the disciple took her into his own home. John's home was Ephesus. John's tomb is in Ephesus. His basilica is in Ephesus. The council letter that first mentioned the tradition was written in Ephesus. The stone foundations on Mount Caressos date to the 1st century. 5 popes visited without issuing a declaration. The indulgences were transferred from Jerusalem to Ephesus in 1896. The mathematics is not complicated. The only missing element is the sentence. The institutional sentence, the formal declaration, the doctrinal statement that would officially close the question in the direction the evidence points, and simultaneously require the Church to officially re-examine the Jerusalem tradition it has been promoting for 16 centuries on the other side. That sentence has not been issued. It has been replaced by a bronze lamp, by a mass for thousands of pilgrims, by you who live here, by a Vatican representative who finishes his answer and goes back to praying. The Church does not take an official position, but you just read the file. And somewhere in you, in the part that does not need an official position to understand what it is reading, something has already settled. Not about faith, not about doctrine, not about whether Mary was assumed bodily into heaven, or whether the Dormition Abbey on Mount Zion is a sacred place. About this, a stone house on a mountain in Turkey has 1st century foundations. A German nun described it before it was found. 5 popes visited it, and from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. John's home was Ephesus. The mathematics was always there. 16 centuries. Waiting for the Church to complete it. This is Nathan. Forbidden Gospels. I'll let you sit with that.